Welcome, everyone, to another episode of To The Point with Greg and Grant. This is the podcast that gets to the point, stays on point, and makes a point. We are focused on the aerospace and defense industry, as you guys already know. Grant, would you like to say hello?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Appreciate you joining us here, and I'm hoping that you checked out part one of our Ellis Freedman interview, where we talked a lot about his career early on, as well as various applications of remote sensing, traditional and a little bit more forward-looking.
Yes, and now as we get into part two, we're going to delve more into the career and industry challenges, as well as talking about the extrovert versus introvert discussion that was interesting, and get some thoughts from Ellis there. But all right, enough of that. Let's get to the point. Ellis Freedman, part two, right now.
So, Ellis, based on your extensive background that you have, what was the hardest challenge you faced in your career?
Bureaucratic management and management that lacked creativity and insight. I feel like I spent my whole career fighting that. Well, maybe not my whole career, but much of it.
Much of it. What were the ways that you actually were able to combat that or help with that challenge?
It was always difficult.
Yeah.
Usually I would try to work around it. I would try to find an advocate, somebody who would listen to me, perhaps outside the normal chain of command. You have to be careful with that. You don't want to really upset the people who didn't like your ideas. Sometimes it took going outside the organization, maybe to a government official, maybe whispering in their ear and going through back channels. Sometimes it took just doing things on my own. Saying, okay, you're not going to pay me to do it. I'll do it on my own time, and then maybe you'll like it. Sometimes that worked.
So you have to actually invest with your own time and efforts to make a point or to prove a concept.
Yes.
Whatever it could be. Fascinating.
I find it's almost a prerequisite out there. There's nothing wrong if somebody wants to become an engineer and just take assignments, go off into their cubicle, work on them, feed things back out when they're done. But if you want to make a big difference and you want to excel, you're going to have to do a lot on your own. You have to pursue it in your spare time, from home. If you're lucky enough to go to conferences, talk to people there, maybe do your own calculations on your own time, on your lunchtime, things like that. Albeit, you have to be careful. You don't want to start using resources you're not allowed to use.
Sure.
Yeah, you have to act on your own. That's what it comes down to. And perhaps make friends who are willing to do that with you.
No, that's great advice. And if I could follow up on that question, so I hear different things about out in the industry. There's someone out there doing TED Talks about being an introvert. Engineers are mostly introverts. Would you agree with that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I've known both.
Me too.
But having said that, I find that the extroverts tend to end up in management. I know a lot of engineers who are introverts. I don't even know if I'd want to call them introverts, but they tend to be quiet.
Yeah.
They tend to work on their own. They don't make waves. And that's fine.
Absolutely.
I've ended up fighting for a few of them when they get overlooked, because unfortunately, usually the only one who will toot that horn is you.
And that's where I'm kind of going with that. Just not that there's a good or bad thing in either being an extrovert or introvert, but simply with that advice that you just laid out, how does one that maybe is more quiet, more introverted, if they want to aspire for growth and positions within an organization, how would they do that? How would you recommend they do that if they're maybe uncomfortable trying to go around and maybe make friends as you just described?
Well, the only way I can think of is to find a champion, find somebody
Okay.
who will,
Yep.
who recognizes your good work and who is willing to go to bat for you. Somebody who's willing to talk to management. I did that a couple of times. There was a woman in my group. I'd worked with her off and on, and she was very unhappy. She confided in me briefly. At one point, she was unhappy. She felt she was being left behind. And it turns out that she had not received a promotion in a long time. She'd done great work. She was actually our local IEEE representative. And no one seemed to care. And when I found out how much money she was making and her position, I went and I yelled at her manager. And I said, "Why are you doing this? This is one of your best engineers. You have to give her a promotion. You have to give her a raise. We don't want to lose her. And even if she stays, you want to make her a little bit happy. Recognize her contributions." And she did get the raise, and she got a promotion. But I had to go do it for them.
Right.
So
Did she come to you? So she confided in you, or did you kind of get it out?
she didn't ask me to
Yeah.
do it,
Mhm.
but she did confide in me that she
Yeah.
was upset.
Okay.
She felt she was being treated unfairly.
Oh, that's a great story.
So clearly, all those the red tape with management and the stifling of creativity, that's I would imagine a challenge that a lot of people struggle with, and not just you.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
From what you've seen over the years, how does that impact the organization as a whole? Do you think it holds the organization back from getting into new areas and improving their profits, all of those things?
Absolutely. I'm sure you know about the old law that says 20% of the people do 80% of the work,
Yes.
Yes, we do.
and 80% to 20%. And
Right, a principle, right?
Yeah.
right, that becomes self-reinforcing, unfortunately. And I mean, there are a lot of books on this subject. I mean, Parkinson's Law, the Peter Principle, they're all out there. The trouble is, it makes organizations, it gives them a lifespan where they start to grow, they do really well in the beginning, they hit some bumps in the road when they become a medium-sized company. When they get to be a really big, established, stalwart company, that's when things start to fall over, because now people don't want to change. They think the best way to rise in the company is to become a manager and keep doing what they've been doing. And they stop expanding, and they stop looking for innovation, and they start falling apart again. And it's a real issue. Most people don't recognize that. Most organizations don't recognize that. And that's because the people in there who are in positions of power don't see any reason to change, because it jeopardizes their position. If they've been in a position as, say, a top manager for 10 years, somebody comes along and says, we have to innovate. We have to cut down on our managers. We have to go into a field you know nothing about. Their first reaction is, I don't want to do that. I'm a manager. I like my pay. I don't want to have to go look for a job, or I don't want to have to change things around here. I've been doing what I've been doing for a long time. Why would I bother? So they'll fight it.
So complacency is a real issue then, if those managers have been there for a while.
Oh,
They
certainly.
don't-
I mean, yes. I mean, I've seen this so many times. I don't even know what story to tell. But there have been a lot. There was, without going into too much detail,
Sure.
there was a time when I had actually complained, well, not complained, I had questioned management when we got to see Jack Welch, the chairman of GE at the time. And I had asked him a question from a big audience, so I thought I was a nobody. And basically, I asked the question, that I agreed with his concepts of what they called the workout at that time. But what was I supposed to do when my management wouldn't let me do the kind of work that needed to be done, when they would do it on their own and then leave me out? And he said, well, presumably that'll fix itself, but if it doesn't, if I were you, I'd quit and get the hell out. I wouldn't want to work for people like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And, well, Jack Welch understood it. I may disagree with a lot of what Jack Welch said, but he was right about a lot. When we got back to our local offices, our local vice president called us all into a room, ostensibly to find out how we liked the meeting. And he went around the room and he said, I'd like to get your opinion. It turns out we'd been taking a course at the time. I'd like to get your opinion of the course, about your facilities, where you went, what you think of things, and what you think about management. And he said, let's start with you, Ellis.
Imagine that.
I thought you were going to go there.
Right, and everybody laughed. And one of the things that I said was, well, for one thing, despite the fact that you say we should be judged based upon our performance, people don't get performance appraisals. And his administrator, who was in the room, said, that's not true. I said, yeah, it is. And to his credit, his vice president said, we can settle this quickly. How many people in the room have had a performance appraisal this year? No hands went up. How many in the last 2 years? One hand went up. How many in the last 5 years? 3 more hands went up. He said, I get the message. Okay? So that was a big issue. So that started this whole conversation. And when I brought up my question, again, there was pushback about, oh, no. Certainly managers let engineers do their work. And another person who happened to be a low-level manager, he said, no, actually, that's not true. My manager has specifically come out and said, I get paid to do engineering. I don't get paid to do management, even though he was a manager. And the vice president was astonished. But that's what happens. That's actually part of the Peter principle, where it says that you rise to your level of incompetency. You may be a great engineer, and then you turn around, they say, well, if you're a great engineer, we should make you a manager of engineers.
Yeah.
But you're a lousy manager.
Right.
But then the Peter principle corollary says, well, now you've hit Peter's plateau. They don't send you back to being a manager. They just don't let you go any higher. So that's the kind of issue you end up with. It's I don't know whether it's a natural part of the evolution of companies, or if it's just something that's natural to some companies and not others. Some companies don't seem to suffer too much, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting story. So if we step back now from the industry perspective, Ellis, and great personal stories that you just provided us, what, in your experience, what do you feel are the top 2 challenges in the aerospace and defense industry today?
Biggest problems are government cutbacks and fewer companies.
You say fewer companies?
Fewer companies, yes. Companies have been consolidating and joining with other companies for many years now. In fact, let's see. How many companies build fighter airplanes in the United States nowadays? There's Boeing and Lockheed. That's it. McDonnell Douglas was absorbed. General Dynamics was absorbed. And the same thing is happening everywhere. Go back to my example of Planet Labs. A while ago, I did some work for a company called Rapid Eye, which had a constellation of satellites. German company. Planet Labs bought them. Now they're part of their constellation. Well, actually, Rapid Eye was bought by Blackbridge in Canada, which was then bought by Planet Labs. So that took out 2 whole companies at once. Digital Globe is now owned by Maxar, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
So there are fewer companies. With fewer companies comes less competition.
Less competition, sure.
becomes harder to find a job, especially in your field. And of course, each of these companies gets bigger, which means it becomes more bureaucratic, inevitably. So there's that problem on one end. And on the other hand, of course, the government keeps trying to cut back on spending. Not that I blame them, but it becomes a real problem. And unfortunately, the government doesn't know how to solve these problems for the most part. They keep aspiring to solve certain problems, especially with cost. Never seems to work for some reason. Every Landsat seems to come in at $800 to $900 million, despite technology advances, despite basically the same performance in every satellite since 1984. Mm-hmm. They still come in at $800 to $900 million. I know people can come along and build something cheaper that will do the same thing. For some reason, it never happens. So
why do you think that is?
Probably a combination of things. Bureaucracy, again. Part of it is trying to reduce risk. Mm-hmm. I was working on a team that was trying to go after Landsat 8, and we believed that we could build it cheaper. And we lost that. That went to Ball Aerospace. Ball with the sensor anyway. And then we went after 9, and it was decided by the government that to reduce risk, they didn't want to change the design at all. Just go with what they knew from the same manufacturer. They knew it would cost more money, but risk is a big deal in government contracts.
Doesn't that stifle innovation?
Yes, but you have to weigh innovation against risk. And I don't object to that. It's absolutely something you should take into account. Mm-hmm. At some point, personally, I believe one will definitely outweigh the other. If I could build two new innovative satellites for the price of one old one, right. And one of them fails, I'm still ahead of the game. But you combine bureaucracy with risk, and part of it, I don't think my NASA friends are going to like this, but part of it is NASA is science oriented, and they have a bunch of scientists. They are not system engineers for the most part. They are not contract people. So they may know the science behind what they want. They have no idea how to build something necessarily at a certain cost, or how to write requirements that will drive them in a certain direction. That's going to get me in trouble. So, for example, this is another example. On my own time, I actually wrote requirements for Landsat 7, just as a favor. This was way back in the 80s, mid-80s. And they were included in the requirements. Those requirements are still in the specifications now, even though some of them have nothing to do with the design of the system. The design is completely changed. You're going from, say, a whisk broom scanner to a push broom scanner. So you're not going to end up with lines caused by 8 detectors going back and forth. So why do you have a requirement in there that it not be there? There's another requirement for what do they call bright target recovery. On which one was it? Landsat 4 or 5. There was a slightly off detector that when it saw something very bright, I don't remember which band it was in, but instead of causing just a bright pixel, it took a long time to recover, so you get a little streak in the image. Well, that doesn't happen anymore because we don't use those detectors anymore. But that's been around since 1982. But the scientists don't want to go back and change requirements. They just say, I'll use the same requirements I've used for the last 20 years. Because I don't want to have to write that.
Gotcha. Yep.
So those requirements end up adding to the cost because somebody has to make sure that they're designing around it. And then they have to make sure that they do testing that doesn't exhibit that problem. And then they have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. All that adds cost.
Sure it does.
So,
Yeah, it's that great example of those challenges there. So what would be some solutions to those challenges then,
well,
in your view?
there are a couple of things, I'm sure. One is when I was first brought into GE, I was part of what's called Systems Integration Shop, the SI, they called it. And the SI was an independent contractor who was hired to make sure that the proper requirements were met, that performance levels were being met, to do analyses that perhaps the prime contractor or the subcontractors couldn't solve or wouldn't work on, and basically to integrate everything so it worked properly. And that worked beautifully for many years until the government decided we don't need a system integrator. We can either let the prime contractor do it. And of course, the prime contractor has a conflict of interest because they're overseeing themselves. They want to make more money. And in many cases, they will charge on a cost plus contract, which means, okay, well, we'll throw this extra testing in there because for every test we do, we make a profit. And the longer we work, we make a profit. So, but the government decides, or sometimes the government decides, we can do that. The trouble is the government doesn't have people necessarily that do that, or enough people. So one of the things I thought was really good was to have a separate system integration contractor or department. It doesn't even have to be a separate contractor. That would solve a lot of these problems. The other one is not so easy to solve, especially on government contracts. The problem in the government is that careers are made by jumping from one program to a bigger program. You don't earn points or get promotions by saying, look, I solved this problem and saved you $100 million. You end up with a situation where you may be in a $100 million program and you make sure that it becomes a $200 million program before you rotate out to your next program, because now you've shown I can handle a $200 million program, not a $100 million program. So put me on a $500 million program. That's how you get ahead in the government. It's a terrible way to do things. There was actually a 60 Minutes story on this way back when, on a project called Trailblazer. And I'll let people look that up on their own. It's too long to go into.
Sure.
I had that problem on a more local level. I had done a lot of analysis on something for a system, and I discovered that we could eliminate one whole part of the subsystem. We could eliminate testing. We would get better performance than the specification, and probably end up saving, I'll estimate, $10 to $20 million. And I called the customer. Now, this is not my customer. This was the customer for the people building this. And I explained to him how he could save money, he could cut back on the requirements, he would have better performance than he was asking for, and he could save a fortune. And he said, thanks anyway, but we're going to keep going the way we're going. And I said, maybe I didn't explain myself properly. You can save $10 million. You can get better performance than you're asking for now. You can eliminate some of the hardware. And he said, no, I understood. We're going to keep going the way we're going. I have my reasons. Okay. And The reason was, if he made it a smaller program that came in ahead of schedule, then he couldn't say, oh, I want a bigger program later on because I made this program shrink.
Yeah.
So personal interest.
And I don't know how to solve that problem in the government. So if somebody can come up with a solution, that's great. But
well, with the government cutting back, they're almost forced to now do other things.
you would think, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, the government's not always logical. Okay. I don't think this is going to change much of anything, to be honest.
Okay.
It's a little like asking, why can't we have a balanced budget? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Yeah. No.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish that I could fix it, but these are some of the impediments you have to work against.
Yeah.
At least in the aerospace industry and defense industry.
Sure. Yep.
It's different in other industries, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Ellis, as we come up toward the end of part 2 here, I did have a fun, pointed question for you, if I may. If you could go back in time and be a part of any aerospace and defense program, what program would you like to add to your resume?
The SR-71.
And why so?
It was cutting edge in many, many ways. It required incredible innovation. And as far as I know, we haven't been able to beat its technology even today. We tried to retire it. We brought it back again. I don't know what its current status is. I think we retired it again, not knowing what's going on in that side of the Air Force. I can't say it's been replaced, but it was probably the most advanced aircraft ever built.
So, all right.
That was decades ago, too.
It was 1960 or so.
Wow.
That's
Fantastic.
amazing.
Terrific.
I want it on my resume, too.
All right, so it's time to wrap up with part 2 of our 3-part series with Ellis Freedman, where we talked about the career and industry challenges, and as well as the extrovert versus introvert discussion, which is very interesting. So next time we're going to be talking about the series of part 3 of the series, where we get into more of the national security discussion, as well as advice for those entering into the industry, and whether Ellis thinks it's better to be more broad-based or more specific-based with your skill sets. So until then, we will talk to you soon.
The views expressed in this podcast are our own and not those of the companies we work for currently or previously, or of any person or organization affiliated or doing business with those companies.